Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Respecting the Beer. My name is Gary Arndt. With us again is the professor, Allison McCoy,
Hi.
and the sage of suds, the chancellor of beer school, Mr. Joel Hermansen. We're here to talk some more about beer in American history. In this episode, we're going to be talking about lagers in the 19th century and how beer really changed in the United States from what we were talking about in the last episode. We were talking about early American beers, the role that it played in the fermentation of the American Revolution, and what then changed.
First of all, thank you for Sage of Suds.
Oh my God, I'm writing this down.
That is maybe the greatest nickname that's ever been bestowed upon me. Yeah, and just as a quick refresher, if you hadn't listened to the previous episode, the last 5 minutes, please stop what you're doing and go back and listen to just that, where we talked about kind of the profiles and flavors that you would have found at an early 19th century public house. Particularly pay attention to the comments on patriarchy. Those were excellent. But I think in the early 19th century, there's 4 enormous changes in brewing that emerge. And we'll just kind of run through these and we'll kind of get some questions about those. But the first one is in the 1820s, there is a massive migration of German people to the Americas. And German people are going to bring a beer culture wherever they go, and they brought it to the United States. So that's going to be change number one.
And what's the difference between what they brought versus what was here beforehand that the English had?
Yeah, there's going to be a greater emphasis on lagering. And the second big change, just to, kind of get a little bit ahead of myself, is going to be the arrival of lager yeast in the 1830s. Lagering, and for those, just a super fast, quick brewing explanation, there's 2 types of yeast. There's ale yeast and lager yeast. Ale yeast ferment from the top down, and they function at much warmer temperatures, which is why most, home brewers that don't have the capacity to chill beer while it's fermenting, they're going to use ale yeast because ale yeast can thrive at 70 degrees or room temperature. So almost all of the beer all of the beer before the 19th century that was brewed here was brewed with ale yeast. In the 1830s, shortly after the arrival of the German population, and then, the Germans came to the coastal cities and then gradually migrated to the Middle West, which is why places like St. Louis and Milwaukee and Cincinnati have such a strong German, connection. At the same time that they're arriving in those places, we are seeing the arrival of lagering yeast. Lagering yeast ferments from the bottom of the vessel to the top. It's a bottom fermenting yeast, and it has to be chilled. And this is one of the reasons when you look at the early brewing cities in the United States, St. Louis is one, obviously being, from Wisconsin. We're partial to Milwaukee. Milwaukee, no offense to St. Louis, is probably the more important brewing city in American history. And one of the fundamental reasons behind that is the German population that arrived in Milwaukee in the 1820s, 30s, and the arrival of lagering yeast. So a lager is going to be a beer that, as we were talking about at the end of our previous episode, those early American ales were probably, I'm going to borrow Dr. McCoy Fleshman's words, they were acrid. There was a lot of off flavors. It didn't have probably a very pleasant mouthfeel to it. If you've ever had a really good lager like McFleshman's Pirates Cove is outstanding, you're going to find a beer that is incredibly crisp. And the yeast have been very, very active. They have had the temperature to function at, and the beer is incredibly clear. So beer becomes clarified, it becomes refrigerated, particularly in the Midwest, not using, refrigeration. That's a concept that happens, much later after the Civil War, but they're using just the cold temperatures of this region. So people were brewing in large quantities, particularly after, October, because they had the climate to do so.
With what you were saying with respect to St. Louis and Milwaukee, I think you're right. St. Louis had one very successful brewery that came out of there, whereas in Milwaukee, you had so many different ones. You had Schlitz, Pabst, Blatz, Miller. All of these are German last names that came out. A lot of them eventually disappeared, but you just had this ecosystem of brewing. And Milwaukee, even when I was growing up, was known as Beer City. That's what truckers called it.
Right. And I mean no offense to St. Louis. St. Louis has a terrific beer history as well. But St. Louis isn't as cold.
Yeah.
St. Louis didn't have a proximal geography to the city of Chicago, where after the Chicago fire in the 1870s, they needed, because Chicago was also a great brewing town, but after the fire occurred, Milwaukee kind of stepped into that void and completely took over the region's brewing prowess. And that's where you started to see kind of this migration from, large breweries. I would say that, the early breweries in Milwaukee, Schlitz and Blatz and stuff, they were very large, but they weren't what they were after that Chicago fire. Like, they become these monolithic brewing, companies that are producing, in the case of Pabst, I think they hit 1 million barrels a year in the 1890s. That's an incredible amount of brewing. And you don't have that, particularly in an age before refrigeration. And if you don't like Wisconsin winter, you're not going to like this comment, but we're blessed with phenomenal lagering weather. There's nothing better than doing a home brew in Wisconsin. And, you have to try to do your best to bring that temperature down to 68 as quickly as you can. You brew in your kitchen on a day that's 10 below zero, you put your brew kettle outside for 10 minutes and you're there. We have this remarkable opportunity to do that.
All of these cities you mentioned that were heavily settled by Germans are in what was called at the time the West. We call it the Midwest today. What role did the Erie Canal play in, I suppose, beer and also the settlement of that region?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because that was number 3. The Erie Canal, for those who don't know, connects the Atlantic Ocean through the Hudson River to the Great Lakes. And all of a sudden, what the Erie Canal really does is it takes the coastal region of the United States, which had developed obviously more urban and cosmopolitan culture, and all of a sudden it connects it to other parts of the country. And ideas flow. Technology flows, goods and services, people flow, and all of a sudden the Midwest starts to grow and experience some of the same things that were happening on the East Coast. It becomes easier to get ingredients. For example, New York was the largest producer of hops in the early 19th century. And, hops are then finding their way to cities like Milwaukee, where they're using lagering yeast and they're producing these remarkably crisp beers that, particularly when you're serving it in February in Wisconsin, they're ice cold. And I think the entire, notion of beer changed. Philadelphia was another place that it changed quite a bit, because they had a climate that was closer to Milwaukee than it was to, for example, Richmond, Virginia. So they started to use lager. And a lot of this was kind of fueled by that Erie Canal, which also, and this is innovation number 4, brought Irish people to the Midwest. Obviously, the potato blight in the 1845, 1846, the migration of Irish people was occurring at astonishing numbers. In many cases, they were kind of forced to leave Europe, so they came here and they settled on the eastern seaboard. They moved to the Midwest through the Erie Canal and the communication networks, and they brought a completely different style of beer. Like, the Germans brought lager, and the Irish are going to bring stouts.
Yes.
But you can't make a stout unless you have the appropriate malt. So the other thing that happens is you start to see new developments in malting, like the rotary malting convection oven or the rotating drum that you can really darken malts.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't.
It's a glorious black perfection. Oh, it tastes so good.
Right. And you can't do that with the malting that they were doing in the late 1700s, early 1800s. You can't.
Just to go back briefly on what you said about the Erie Canal, most people don't realize if you were to look at one of the reasons why the United States was so successful and grew so fast in the 19th century, the United States has the largest inland waterway system in the world.
Yep.
If you use the entire Mississippi River Basin, the Great Lakes, and the intercoastal waterway system along the East Coast, it's larger than all the other inland waterway systems in the world combined, which meant that you had this enormous area where goods could travel easily, and allowed for something that was in the Midwest to service things that were otherwise on the East Coast. I think it was James Monroe that initially talked about one of the initial problems in the United States was the tyranny of space, that you had these enormous distances, and it was cheaper to ship, say, a piece of furniture from London to Philadelphia than it was to take that same piece of furniture 40 miles inland.
Yep.
Because it was so expensive to do it by land. But that inland system revolutionized the entire economy, and obviously it completely helped in this particular part of it in terms of beer.
This is why Gary Arndt is a national treasure. That little interlude right there. Connecting James Monroe, the freight rates along the Erie Canal. I'm just
water made transportation at the time cheap, and that is what made so much of the country up until you get to the Rocky Mountains accessible.
There is even an inland or a seaport, if you will, in Oklahoma. It reaches that far in.
Really?
The port of Catoosa is what it's called. It's kind of near Tulsa.
Huh. About a mile from where we're sitting, you can get in a canoe and you can go all the way to the Atlantic Ocean.
Rock on.
Go down the Fox River to Lake Michigan, down the little St. Lawrence Seaway, and get there from there. And a lot of people don't realize that you can, or if you wanted to, you could go down Lake Michigan, go to Chicago, and go to St. Louis or to New Orleans via the Mississippi River. It's that connected.
So speaking of connections and trade networks and communication networks, the Erie Canal is the first big one. The second big one, which you mentioned getting to the Rockies. Well, all of a sudden in the period after the Civil War, as people are migrating west, even in the pre-Civil War period, as part of that manifest destiny, that is largely fueled by railroads. So on the one hand, you're able to easily get to the Middle West through the Erie Canal, but then after that period, you're finding it far easier, particularly by 1870, to get all the way to the Rockies and then even beyond to the Pacific, which is also going to change the beer culture. Because one of the things, and we're going to come back to the quote again, Charlie Bamforth, beer is kind of this constant and things change around it. And when the Irish came to the Midwest, they brought stout styles. When the Germans came, they brought lagering styles. When you start to move to the Rockies and beyond, you're starting to see, again, additional changes, to brewing. So all of these things kind of connect. And not to simplify it, but beer really is the basis of static civilization.
I mean, in our previous episode, we had Nicola Twilley on, and she talked a lot about the role of refrigeration and the role that beer played in it.
You can get her book Frostbite on some places you can get books on the interwebs.
But yeah, that was enormous. It wasn't just that refrigeration played a role in beer, but beer was a driving force behind refrigeration.
Yes.
And also, I think, was really responsible for the popularity of lagers. The Germans brought lagers here, but what allowed it to really expand and for everyone to drink it was the fact that you could drink a cold beer. And up until that point, the idea of a cold one didn't really exist.
Unless you were in Milwaukee in February.
Right.
Mm.
But
then you would also be the cold one because you're surrounded by the, frozen depths of the tundra because it's so damn cold.
Yes.
It really isn't that cold here.
Oh my God, dude, I'm from the South. It's so cold.
No,
Coming back to refrigeration starts to appear in the 1880s. which is also really the time in which America has multiple industrial revolutions. The first one is in, the 1820s and 30s, where we're starting to see the beginnings of steel production and iron, and that's ultimately going to fuel railroad technology. But the second one occurs really after Thomas Edison enters the equation with incandescent lights and electricity, and Alexander Graham Bell and the telephone. Refrigeration is a part of that. And refrigeration changes kind of the entire calculus of how beer is brewed, as does pasteurization. Can you give us a quick scientific overview of pasteurization?
Hot stuff kills bugs.
There you go.
Thank you, Dr. McCoy.
That was fabulous. But again, when you add that to refrigeration, to lagering, you're going to have beer that has a longer shelf life. You're going to ultimately start to move into a place, and I think this really happens during that Prohibition period, which is part of our next episode, is you start to see drinking at home.
Oh, that's a lovely thing.
Yes, because that was never possible unless you were extremely wealthy and had your own
you
cast
could have a
engine.
bottle of whiskey.
Right, but you're not drinking beer at home.
Yeah.
And to go back to pasteurization, this has been a common theme on my podcast in many episodes, that I would say, like, if we were to lose all the knowledge of our civilization, what's the one sentence that we would probably want to take forward? It's that the germ theory of disease.
Oh, absolutely.
That this was something that people had kind of figured, they knew that there was something. Ignaz Semmelweis was the Hungarian who figured out at a maternity hospital that if doctors washed their hands, it lowered the fatality rate. John Snow was the epidemiologist in London who figured out the cholera epidemic, but they didn't know what it was that was causing it. And it was Louis Pasteur, that probably did the biggest part of it, that figured out that there were germs, that these microscopic things that they had seen before through microscopes was the cause of this stuff. And that, not just in terms of health, but also in terms like in brewing and food science and food preservation, was enormous. And a huge chunk of the increase in life expectancy that we've seen over the last 100 years, I'd say the majority of it is that one thing.
Probably so.
Louis Pasteur was working at a brewery.
Yeah,
when he
rock
made
star.
this discovery.
I think part of that too, creating stainless steel or just steel in general is also kind of this side story of how the brewing industry really was revolutionized. So like under pasteurization, you need to get it really, really hot, but you can also do it under really high pressure. You have to have these vessels that you can put under really high pressure, like autoclaves and such. And so anything under high pressure is going to break or bust. And so that's where the steel comes in. This is one of the reasons that in the late 1600s, the thermodynamicists in France were doing all of these studies on pressure and volume of gases, and then the balloonists came from that. But it's really hard to get things under pressure without things exploding. So most stuff was done at constant pressure just because it was safer and you could, didn't get glass in your eye or something like that.
Yeah.
And so I think that with the materials, they were able to then push the technology forward. And this goes back to what you were saying with the malting. One of the problems of getting that really roasty, crisp grain malted, or roasted, I should say, is that most of the places would catch on fire before they could actually low and slow toast the
right.
grain.
And that goes into another thing too. All beers, there's a special type of beer. And for those who are new to the podcast, I'm a very fussy beer drinker.
One of the fussiest, actually. You're kind of a diva beer person who's very much... Oh, I'm sorry. This is recording.
I think that was a compliment. I'm not sure. But like a smoky beer.
Yeah.
I hate smoky beers.
But
that would be all you would be able to
That's actually what they would have tasted like back in the day.
Because when you are doing this kind of primordial roasting, you are undoubtedly getting smoky flavors.
Yeah.
But as beer becomes, and I love your mention of stainless steel.
Or just steel in general.
Right. But beer becomes industrialized, and it becomes an industrial process. And being that it's an industrial process, they sought efficiency. They sought redundancy. They sought the ability, and Bobby has said this on a number of occasions, and I think people that don't know what he's talking about were probably like, really? Because you're a craft brewer. But he will tell you that the best brewers in the world are the ones that work at the domestic.
Technically, they're really now computer programmers are the best brewers in the world because the big industrial systems are so automated, but they have it to the like 8th decimal place of accuracy, or actually I should say precision on that part.
And do they produce the best beer? Do they produce the widest variety? No, but they're able to redundantly make the same product over and over. So it became industrialized. It became efficient.
And to add to what you said about steel, steel wasn't widely manufactured until the development of the Bessemer steel process in 1856, which is happening at the same time you're seeing refrigeration start to come, and all these other things are happening that all lead up to this, that allow for these industrial processes to happen.
I also have to throw in, because this is just way too interesting. It was in mid-1700s, so Daniel Gabriel Fahrenheit was the German physicist who invented the alcohol thermometer in 1709. So the thermometer had at least 100 years of development from that to then know what the temperatures were with all this extra industrial part.
Fun fact, and you know why Fahrenheit picked the scale he did, where 32 degrees is freezing and 212 is boiling?
I sadly know the answer because I just read it on the screen, but tell me, Gary.
Oh, because, well, first of all, we use degree for temperature, but we use degree to also measure the angles of a circle.
Oh.
And 32 and 212 are 180 degrees from each other, which is as far apart as two things could be on a circle, which is why he picked degree as the unit of measure.
Oh, interesting.
A Gary Arndt moment for those who are listening in at home.
That blows my mind because that's not what I just read. So this little thing says he chose 100 degrees on the Fahrenheit scale because that was the human body temperature, but then it was adjusted to 98.6 because he was, not that accurate in his value. But
I had heard that he used a salt-ice combination to pick the
for
0 point.
Yeah, totally. Right. That's so fascinating, but I never knew.
But it was 180.
That's crazy.
Between boiling and freezing.
Because Fahrenheit's the F word around here. We use Celsius because Fahrenheit's a dumb scale.
It kind of is.
It's such a dumb scale.
We'd like to apologize to any partitioners of the Fahrenheit scale.
Nope, not taking that back. Nope, you own it. It's Celsius. Please do Celsius. I have nothing to say after that.
I don't need it. Where does one go after this?
Not to Fahrenheit.
Can I go from temperature to temperance?
Sure.
So we would also be making a mistake as we sit here in the Prohibition room not to kind of talk a little bit about the trajectory of the 18th Amendment, which was probably in part driven by the rise of kind of these industrial brewers like Pabst and Schlitz and later on Miller and all of the tide houses that were springing up supporting their brewing, which was leading to people all over the country, being able to go to a tide house and to drink Schlitz or Blatz or Pabst products or whatever. And they were spending too much of their income at these tide houses, which facilitated the rise of women leading, much of the charge behind that temperance movement. And beer was actually really the primary target because beer was so readily available at that point. Whiskey distillers and things like that, they didn't really have like a tide house, that you would just buy whiskey and oftentimes drink it at home or whatever. But beer, this is in that period before beer is consumable at home. So people were going to these tide houses, which is taking them out of the home, kind of leading to this perception that there was a kind of this degeneration of the family and family values. So that's why beer was really kind of the primary target of the Prohibition movement, which, as we know from looking at the economics of the situation, was an absolute disaster for the United States.
I think we tend to overlook the power of the temperance movement, which was actually a very big social movement at the time. It kind of grew steadily throughout the 19th century. And if you were to make a Venn diagram of the temperance movement, the women's suffrage movement, and the abolitionist movement, there would be a lot of overlap.
There would.
Between those movements. Mm-hmm. And I think two of those we kind of look at as, progression of society. And then the temperance movement we kind of think of as sort of this historical joke. It's something that happened and whatever. But those three things were actually kind of really connected, that you had religious people that were involved in all three.
Well, this is, again, how beer tends to impact all elements of civilization. As you get industrial, efficient, scientific brewing, which is producing more, which is leading to the cultivation of tied houses, there's a cultural movement that responds to that. There's a social movement that responds to that. So all of these things, they're always kind of inexorably tied together.
In fairness, I think it also has to be pointed out that early Americans drank a lot.
They did.
Like
Gallons.
From what I can figure, and I've also done an episode on this, Americans, maybe the early 19th century, may have been the biggest drinkers in world history.
Yes, I would completely agree.
And so the rise of the temperance movement out of that is almost kind of understandable, how it would have happened. Mm-hmm. And because, people have been drinking ales for a long time, and you never saw this movement arise really until it was an American phenomenon at this period, of time.
Question. And I think drinking the ale that we talked about, at the late 19th century public house, that would have been hard to drink a lot of.
Well, I'm wondering now, because as the technology improved for beer, you wouldn't have had those lower ABV beers. You would have actually started to be able to consistently control and get the ABV to be higher. And so now the quantity of beer that you're drinking is becoming closer to, not closer to the ABV of whiskey. But if you continue to drink the small beer 2.8%, but now it's 6% alcohol, you're now not really staying on your feet.
Right. And that's why
pissing off the women who aren't allowed to drink during that time, because you know what? F the patriarchy.
We're going to almost end that on the same note. Even before the Volstead Act, which ended Prohibition and led to the 21st Amendment, there was actually an act before that, the Cullen-Harrison Act, which mandated that beer could not exceed 3.2%, which goes to what you were just talking about, which, if a 200-pound male is drinking 3.2% alcohol, I mean, it is going to take, I don't know what the number is, but it's going to take a significant amount of beer to incorporate intoxication. For those people like myself that like higher ABV beers, 3.2 seems like a really sad number.
Yeah. Whereas tiny people like me love the 3.2 because I can have two of them and still be okay.
Right. That being said, I don't think there were a lot of 200-pound people back then.
True.
Well, anyways, that concludes this episode. So please remember to join our Facebook group, support us over on Patreon, links to both of which are in the show notes. And until next time, please remember to respect the beer.